So welcome. You can just start presenting now if you want.
Thank you so much, Astrid, and thank you to everyone here. I learned so much on Wednesday, and I look forward to learning more today. It's a genuine pleasure to be here with you. And this is my first NAISA conference, and I've benefited, as indicated, from especially I want to emphasize the multidisciplinary, supradisciplinary exchanges that are available at NAISA conferences, as this one indicates so well. I'm primarily of French, Scottish, and Irish descent, and I'm a settler on the traditional lands of the Monacan Nation. You can see the title here of my talk, the main title, which is the one that appears on the program. There's a new subtitle, and the contents of the talk today and the article manuscript on which it's based indicate the reasons for the subtitle. Oh. Whoop, there we go. Okay, so the research question: why and to what effect do political elites favor the political inclusion of marginalized peoples? This is a timely and urgent question. My focus is on the Sami of Fennoscandia. A map of the talk. You can see the 5 parts placing the question and available scholarship. I present the argument, move to the research design, present findings, both qualitative and briefly quantitative, and I'll discuss implications at the end. So to place the question in available research literature briefly, there are multiple bodies of political science research that relate to, but offer little guidance on the study of the inclusion of indigenous peoples in Europe. And so I've identified what might be thought of as the 3 usual suspects that might be imagined to offer guidance on the study of the inclusion of indigenous peoples in Europe, the literature on the genesis of states, the origin of party systems, and democratization. But they don't really offer guidance on this study. So the question remains open. My argument in brief. I have multiple hypotheses as indicated. And first is the notion that pivot potential induces strategic change. The pivot potential of the marginalized group induces strategic change on the part of elites. And just to distill the notion of a pivotal group is one that has the capacity to tip the balance in elite competition, spelling the difference between victory and defeat. Second hypothesis, elite competition in itself induces strategic change. And then there's also the hypothesis, I label it H2A, where effects interact, the pivot potential and competition interact to increase the probability of strategic change. there are those out there who have written on credible commitment. Once elites select a strategy, how do they commit themselves to implementing it? Although they haven't written on inclusion of marginalized peoples, scholars are concerned about committing to implementing a strategy. And here, the idea is, elites can tie their hands by recruiting to implementing a strategy by recruiting candidates from a group that they're seeking to represent, in my case, the marginalized group, if the argument goes forward. And so I have additional hypotheses echoing the first two hypotheses, focusing on pivot potential competition, and now thinking about, okay, so what's the impact on candidate recruitment from the marginalized group? And there's an analog as well to the effects interact hypothesis, but now thinking about candidate recruitment from the marginalized group. I've been referring to strategies, and it's important to identify what I mean by the strategies. So these are ideal types of 4 different strategies that vary along 2 dimensions, as you can see. The group's rights, denial or extension, and the toleration of the group. It's the institutions, the culture, which could involve suppression or could involve toleration. When we think about the ideal types, inclusion would entail granting rights and allowing the group to abide by its own traditional institutions. And there may be new institutions to boost the group's legislative presence. And this would contrast this, just for example, the most extreme example with the denial of rights in subjugation, forbidding the group from abiding by its own traditional institutions and forcing the group then to accept dominant institutions. Research design. Starting out with Norway, it makes sense to focus on a difficult case for the argument. As I spell out in the paper, in this larger project, I want to focus first on a case where, if my reasoning were to run along Norway correctly, Norway would be the case where you would most expect the reasoning to work. Therefore, if it failed in Norway, it would be expected to fail elsewhere. I have a mixed methods design using both qualitative and quantitative methods. And I operationalize my dependent variables, things to be explained. The probability of change in strategic choice is what I focus on in the hypotheses. I can't observe that. I can observe the event of change. Probability of recruitment of Sami candidates, can't observe that, but I can observe candidate recruitment from Sami hometowns, which is a proxy for this explanandum, as I discuss in the article manuscript. As for the explanatory factors, pivot potential, I focus on the overrepresented far north, where, as you know, the Sami have a relatively great presence. And then since 1949, the founding of the Oslo Sami Association, and also in view of internal migration, I recognize that Sami are clustering in Oslo. For elite competition, I pay special attention to elections in which the inter-party balance of power, and so in the parliamentary system, that means also control of the executive was at stake. And that means I focus on one of the two dominant partisan formations being within 1% of a parliamentary majority. Findings. Okay, first, qualitative analysis. There's some support for the first hypothesis that focuses on the notion of a pivot, and some support for that effects interact hypothesis. Just for example, in 1961, you see accentuated competition and the effects interacting with the close far northern contexts. And that's followed by the 1963 language and education laws. But we also see evidence against the second hypothesis on competition. Thinking about candidate recruitment, as you know, Sami activists have claimed that Norwegian parties didn't place them in safe seats on the party list, which led to separate Sami party lists. Now, let's think back to the ideal types varying along the group's rights and toleration of a group. There are alternative interpretations of the qualitative evidence available. Positive views of strategic change. You might say, oh, in 1980, there's evidence of inclusion, moving from relaxed homogenization to inclusion with the appointment of the Sami Rights Commission. And in 2005, let's focus on the establishment of the Finnmark estate as advancing inclusion, moving from the inclusion before to advancing inclusion. But that's not the only way to read the available qualitative record. What about ongoing assimilation? Astrid, I believe it was you, mentioned ongoing assimilation on Wednesday, and I really plugged into that. And so there is this other way that we can read the available record. So in the 1980s, majority interests prevail, despite the appointment of the Sami Rights Commission, the Alta, and despite the modification of the Alta Dam project, that project did proceed and it was completed. And and just thinking about the separate Sami lists, they have led eventually to the founding of the Sami People's Party in 1999, which has placed candidates in a lot of elections, but in a key way has seen limited success. There are no Sami People's Party seats won in elections to the Storting. So there are alternative readings of the qualitative record. For for the quantitative analysis, so I do this particular kind of statistical model on an amazing data set, candidate level data set for all Norwegian elections from 1906 to 2017, which has been created by John Fiba, who is at the Norwegian Business School, and his colleague Daniel Smith at Harvard. And then I augmented that. There was missing information on Sami candidates, for example, and some other things. And I used primarily Norwegian official documents to augment their data set, but the data set is absolutely fantastic. So let's focus on election and what the findings are briefly. If we assume that a candidate's election can shift both, of a given single candidate can shift both the legislative balance at the margin and therefore the probability of strategic change at the margin, we have evidence that undermines the first hypothesis on pivot potential. The second hypothesis on elite competition on its own also runs into trouble. We do have consistent support for what I label as H2A, effects interacting. That is the only one among the hypotheses on candidate election that finds consistent support. Turning to candidate recruitment from the Sami community, there is partial corroboration of the third hypothesis on pivot potential, in that districts with strong pivot potential in the far north, like Finnmark, see relatively great recruitment from Sami hometowns, which is my proxy for Sami candidate recruitment, focusing on the hometowns. But the other hypotheses on recruitment fall flat. Now, I could elaborate on the pictures that will follow, where I take a closer look at candidate election and recruitment. I think I'll just say something brief about these. Basically, I have multiple figures that are set up from these statistical models that show the average marginal effects on the probability of candidate election. So focusing first on candidate election. I have my cat here, okay. And what you do is, for one of the models, you take varying values of Sami pivot potential and elite competition, and you differentiate candidates according to rank on the party list. Hold everything else equal, the statistical model allows you to do that. And what you see is that the Norwegian pattern closely adheres to conventional wisdom. Candidates placed at the top of a party list on in spot 1, the safest spot, should win election, and they do pretty much, near perfect probability of election. But we have new evidence here that supports the what I label as H2A, in that it's hard to see, but the darkest squares are those in which You see strong Sami pivot potential. Think about Finnmark, for example, the Finnmark constituency, and highly competitive elections. So that's new evidence. I'm realizing where the time is going. We could focus on Sami recruitment as another focus. And basically what you see speeding up is that this pattern of, there's a flat probability that parties recruit Sami candidates into spots on the party list. You don't see candidates being pulled into the top of the list, either overall or after the 1980, what might be interpreted as advent of inclusion. And last thing I'll point out here, I deliberately set up the plots so that the vertical axis is the same on all plots. And you can see here that after 1980, the probability of Sami candidate recruitment is lower as compared to overall. Now, implications. The statistical results confirm what I've labeled as H2A, with effects interacting to affect strategic change, and partial support arises for the third hypothesis. Comparing margins plots, those pictures that I just showed you, reveals the conjunction of inclusion and injustice. Reflections, incumbent strategy, whatever it is, however revealed by clashing interpretations of the qualitative record, for example, needn't reach the mass level. It's striking that in the 2017 Norwegian National Survey, almost 3/4 of respondents agreed minorities should adapt to Norwegian customs and traditions. On the same statement, only about 8% disagreed. Without entering into detail, this study shows the promise of studying Sweden and Finland. And then beyond the Fennoscandian democracies, there's a dearth of political science research on the Sami in the former USSR and now Russia. And I think we could have insights into, for example, the use of coercion against minorities, the maintenance and erosion of an internal empire. The few studies that exist indicate, oh, wow, yes, we could learn about this. Beyond Fennoscandia, the paper's argument and evidence, while original, resonate with research on Muslims in Europe, race and ethnicity in the US, and indigenous peoples in North America. I aim to, and in Latin America, I aim to contribute to an enlargement of the comparative politics of race, ethnicity, and indigeneity, which would steer further inquiry into the limits of inclusion. And a very few minutes for questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? If there are any among the attendees, you can also write in the chat. I have a short question or comment. I think that your presentation is really interesting, and I think that also touches upon something that hasn't really been debated that much recently, but I know that this is also an issue that is relevant for and something that engaged, for example, Sami politicians. And I think that can you say maybe something about kind of, for example, New Zealand have this Maori seats in the parliament, while we don't have that in Norway. And I think that also Sami politicians strategically have chosen to focus on an independent parliament because they also then can have, for example, consultations with different governments. While if you're just kind of a normal representative in the parliament, you can of course raise political issues, but you don't automatically have that much power to actually influence policies and policy making. But of course, I don't think that is a kind of right or wrong answer here. Can you maybe say something about kind of how this works internationally and kind of the pros and cons?
Thank you so much. So I'll stop the share. So thank you for bringing that up. I was interested to read that there has been some discussion of the possibility of reserved seats for the Sami in the Storting, as in, for example, New Zealand. Also, Bolivia has something like this. But it didn't really, that proposal didn't get anywhere. And it seems as though the focus on the Sami parliament has subsumed that. It would be interesting to look at the process. Thank you so much. To look at the process by which the focus on the Sami parliament has, I used the term before, I don't know, this is the best verb, subsumed debate on reserved seats for the Sami, because the Sami People's Party has won seats at multiple levels. I mean, it's, as I read about that on the People's Party webpage, I was really struck at the successes in gaining representation, but not so far in quote unquote normal competition for the Storting. So, however, there have been steps forward, not only the establishment of the Sami parliament in Norway, but there are comparisons of the multiple Sami parliaments across the Fennoscandian democracies, and experts agree that the Norwegian is the most powerful. And then there is the consultation procedure that's been set up. And I don't know the role of the Sami parliament. I need to research that more. In moving towards the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but so recent, but that would be an important factor potentially. Yeah.
And how do you think this new, we got a new law last year on consultations, and before it has been kind of a more informal agreement between Norwegian government and the Sami parliament that the Sami parliament should be consulted, while the new law on consultation also include consultation on local level, for example, in municipalities and counties, and consultations with, for example, even individual reindeer herders in cases that affects them directly. Do you think that, how do you think that also influence kind of policies on a more formal level?
Well, the political scientist view would be that when you have a rule moving from an informal norm to a formal law, enforcement becomes easier. So deviation from the formal law is much more, should be at least, much more difficult. And it's important to have the local level implantation of formal implantation of consultation, given that Sami communities are strong, in particular municipalities and counties like Finnmark, and then as a county, also electoral district, and then particular municipalities within Finnmark. Obviously, Sami have greater strength in some municipalities than in others. So, so this formal institutionalized right to consultation locally is actually quite important and would be at least logically more difficult to dodge, to evade on the part of majority politicians. They might want to, but they should be institutionally bound by the law on consultation.
Thank you. I think we have to